Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Tariq Khalil, and I am the educational coordinator for the American Muslims for Palestine. It is an honor to have you all join us virtually in the comfort of your homes or elsewhere, wherever you may be. I welcome you all to our 7th educational webinar titled Forgotten Palestinians, Strangers in Their Homeland. Who are the forgotten Palestinians? The Palestinians are one people, yet they are divided, fragmented, and scattered throughout historic Palestine, the surrounding Arab countries, and beyond. As a result of the Nakba, or catastrophe, which began in 1948, approximately 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed from their homes and uprooted from their homeland. The Zionist movement established a state on the ruins of Palestine and ethnically cleansed her people. But approximately 160,000 Palestinians remained in what became the State of Israel, where they live as second or third-class citizens, deprived of their national identity. In Zionist discourse, these Palestinians are referred to as Arab Israelis rather than as Palestinians. And for centuries, Palestinians were the numerical majority in Palestine. And in approximately 1 year, they became a minority in their ancestral homeland. Through a sophisticated system of laws, policies, and use of parastatal and quasi-governmental entities such as the Jewish National Fund, Jewish Agency, and World Zionist Organization, Israel has established an apartheid state and deprived its Palestinian minority of various rights with respect to politics, property, social services, education, culture, language, the list goes on. Yet despite this, these forgotten Palestinians are committed to their liberation and have remained connected to their Palestinian family throughout Palestine and beyond. It's an honor for me to introduce our 2 powerhouse guests who will share their expertise and insight about this very important topic. We have with us Dr. Maha Nassar and attorney Jamil Dakwar. Dr. Maha Nassar is an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. She holds a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. Her book, Brothers Apart, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World, received a 2018 Palestine Book Award for academic titles. In it, she examines how Palestinian intellectuals in Israel connect to global decolonization movements through literary and journalistic writings. Her research also examines how Palestinians have engaged with the Black freedom movement in the United States. Dr. Nassar's analysis and opinion pieces have appeared in the Washington Post, The Conversation, The Hill, 972 Magazine, and elsewhere. She's currently working on her next book, The Palestinians: History of a Global People. We also have with us Jamil Dakwar, a human rights lawyer and chair of Adalah Justice Project's advisory board. Born and raised in Haifa, he was one of the founding lawyers of Adalah, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel. He teaches human rights at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Hunter College, and Bard College. I want to thank you both for being here and to give us your insight and provide your expertise with respect to this very important topic. Thank you both. I want to start off with just a general, broad, all-encompassing question, and then we'll kind of piggyback from there. How do you conceptualize the role of these 1948 Palestinians, as they're called? How do you conceptualize their role in the broader national project and the broader Palestinian liberation struggle? We'll start with you, Dr. Nassar. The floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for convening this very important panel and this discussion. So for me, I'm trained as a historian, and I approach this through a historical lens, and I also approach it through a lens of being a Palestinian American. So as I've come to realize over my years of research, Palestinians in 48 in the Green Line have always been part of the Palestinian national movement. We just haven't always seen it. And this was true in my own case, having grown up as a Palestinian American, the daughter of Palestinian refugees, born and raised in the US, and going to graduate school ostensibly to study Palestinian history. I didn't actually hear much about them or know much about them growing up and even in the beginning of my studies. And I think it's largely because the Palestinians inside are largely framed within an Israeli context as Israeli citizens or as Arab Israelis, as they were often called. And ironically, it wasn't until I was taking a Hebrew class in graduate school that I came across Anton Shammas's essay, The Morning After, which he wrote in 1988, in which he asked what is going to happen to us, the Palestinians in the Green Line, the morning after a Palestinian state is declared in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And I found it such a poignant essay, not only because of the beauty of his own writing. Anton Shammas is a novelist and an essayist and critic, but also because it was a question that I hadn't really thought much about. Like, why haven't we thought much about them? So I dove, quite enthusiastically into this topic, thinking that I'm going to find out more about Palestinian identity inside the Green Line as it's been articulated through literary writings and journalistic writings. And as I was doing my research for my dissertation, I found that they were very much engaged with what was happening in other parts of Palestine, with the Palestinian diaspora, and with the Arab struggles for liberation that were happening, especially in the 1950s and 60s, which is the time period I focus on. And so that was really eye-opening for me and quite a surprise at the time. And now looking back, I'm surprised that I was surprised. In other words, we should have known this and we should have expected this. And the fact that we didn't, at least I didn't, I think speaks a lot to what I said at the opening, which is that they've always been part of the movement. We just haven't seen it as such.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that opening. And same question to you, Brother Jamil. Tfaddal.
Well, thank you very much first for organizing and for inviting us to be part of this event. I would agree that with Dr. Nassar, there was very little understanding and knowledge about the status, the existence of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And it wasn't intentional, both, I would say, from the side of the historical events that happened shortly after 1948, where Palestinian citizens, as you said, the majority of Palestinians became overnight, almost over the course of the war, into refugees. But many of them became displaced within their own homeland. And in fact, you have a big portion of Palestinian citizens who live now within the state of Israel actually were uprooted from their own original villages and towns, and they sought refuge in nearby villages that somehow succeeded to survive the war and the ethnic cleansing that was happening during that time. So the Palestinians in Israel have really went through in a lot of stages. Maybe we'll talk more about the different parts of how this different challenges, different historical challenges. But it was an intention of the Israeli government to marginalize and, in fact, to erase their existence, just like they tried to erase the existence of the whole Palestinian people during the war in 1948. So they were subject to the harshest measures of not only uprooting them, displacing them by force, killing them, subjecting them to massacres like the Kufr Qasim massacre, for example, depriving them of family unification. For example, my own family in Haifa, my mom's aunt was left during the 1948 war to Lebanon, and she wasn't able to come back because she was denied entry by Israel after the war ended. So basically, she haven't seen her family all that time, and only under humanitarian permission, decades later, she was able to visit, and she was able to see her loved ones and my family. They were subject to a military regime from 1948 to 1966, where military martial law was basically imposed on all their life. I grew up hearing those stories because I was born in 1973, so right after that regime was ended in 1966. But that regime really, it was almost the same foundation, the same architect that Israel copied and replicated in the West Bank and Gaza after it captured or occupied those lands in 1967. It consisted of the idea that those people who live there are at best strangers. They don't have any relation to the land. They should be pushed away from their own the land of their ancestors. They will be deprived of their livelihood, particularly in the context of agriculture. Land confiscation was systemic. Was really a policy that was instituted almost on day one. And the same thing happened with their own status. They were, because of the military regime that was instituted, they couldn't practice fully their civil and political rights that were promised under the Israel's Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, had some language around ensuring equality, civil equality for the Arab residents. They were not even called Palestinians, because the United Nations acceptance of Israel was conditioned upon the fact that they need to ensure equality for those minority Palestinian community that remained there. So there was an intentional policy to erase, to disconnect the Palestinians from their roots, from their identity, from the entire, the rest of the Palestinian people, and also from the Arab nations. So the education system, which was separate from day one in Israel, there's a separate education system for the Arab Palestinian citizens and a separate one for Jewish, was also intended to make sure that what we were taught, what the students are taught, and the way that the system has been controlled, including to the point of how teachers and principals were appointed, and went through a very serious and rigorous national security vetting, ensured that they would not learn about their connection to the Palestinian people. They would not learn about the Palestinian history, and they will not be learning about their connection to the Arab world. So that was one part. And the other part, very briefly, is the fact that the Arab nations and Arab countries and other parts of the Arab world really saw Palestinians as if they were collaborators. They were seen as if we had essentially agreed to take on the Israeli citizenship, while the Israeli citizenship really was imposed on us. Palestinian citizens, just like indigenous people, the country came to be imposed on them rather than they accepted, and they had a say in what kind of citizenship and what kind of status they will have. So they were seen by the Arab world as collaborators, as some people who shouldn't be associated with should be any kind of association with them, and as a result, there was a lot of alienation. There was a lack of ability to connect, and that, I think, changed over the years. Obviously, after the '67 war, with breaking at least the boundaries between the West Bank, Gaza, and the Palestinians and Israel, they were able to make those connections, and then more so in the political activism that enforced and made sure, particularly Harakat al-Ard, the Ard movement, as well as other political parties that were created. Harakat Abna al-Balad, the Abna al-Balad movement, and later on in the mid-90s, the Tajammu al-Watani, Democrati, had all made it clear the relationship between the Palestinian citizens and the Arab world. And as a result, and obviously with the technological changes and the ability to travel, and there was much more connection to between the Palestinians and the rest of the Palestinian people inside Israel and the rest of the Palestinian diaspora, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as with the Arab world.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that presentation. Something that you touched on that, when I first started learning about the conflict in my studies, I kind of worked backwards from the occupation, and I kind of worked backwards. And then I learned, when I read about military rule, I was like, well, isn't that the occupation? And then when I learned a little bit more, I said, well, wait a minute. These Palestinians that are living in what is now the normalized area, which is the state of Israel, they went through nearly 20 years, or almost 20 years, of military rule from 48 to 66. Officially 68, actually, when it officially ended. But that was a process to consolidate Israel's settler colonial regime. I mean, throughout from the founding of the state up until 1967, or actually just the first few years, Israel enacted a host of laws to consolidate its land grab at the point, conquering 78% of historic Palestine, passing the absentee property law so that it can consolidate and grab as much property and legalize it. I'm putting that in quotes. Legalize it so that the Palestinians that do have a rightful claim to it cannot get to it. Passing the law of return, the citizenship law, to make sure that now we can ingather the exiles and deny the refugees, the 750,000 that have just been dispossessed, deny them their right to return to their homes, and a host of other laws that they put together, that Israel put together to deprive Palestinians of their identity, their nationality, and to also deprive them of their rights guaranteed under international law. Can you speak to that just initial stage of Israel's founding, where it felt, it tried to convey this image of a democracy, yet imposing military rule and also trying to consolidate the land and prohibit Palestinians from exercising their rights? Anybody can tackle that.
Sure, I'm happy to start and then with the legal framework, and then maybe you can add more. I think the Zionist movement and the founders of the State of Israel had a problem. They had a demographic problem. They had meaning the fact that they understood that this land is heavily populated, in contradiction to the myth or the propaganda that the Palestine was not inhabited, that they're Palestinian. Palestinians were 94% in the turn of the 20th century of the population of Palestine, and yet because of the colonial settler movement in Palestine that really started in the end of 19th century and enhanced during the British Mandate, allowed some shift in the demographic. So they understood that they had a demographic problem, because particularly when they have agreed to the partition of Palestine with the idea that they would have a Jewish sovereignty, or a Jewish state that would be established, and that would be it. But they knew that first would not be possible with the way that it was demarcated. It was the way that it was drawn, the boundaries that were drawn for the partition plan. And second of all, they were not satisfied with the limited access or limited control over the whatever territory that was provided under the partition plan. So when the war ended, and the Zionist groups and militias had a great advantage, by the way, over both the local Palestinian resistance and the Arab armies that came in to protect Palestine from that sort of takeover by Zionist groups after the British Mandate decided to get out. They had a clear advantage, and the historians will now have clearly shown how they had both numerically, but also in terms of the weapons and the training and the organizing that they had. So that's again another myth, as if like all the Arab armies had been defeated because they were just some sort of a miracle. No, it was a clear. Anyway, we move into the reality where the Zionist founder of the State of Israel had to deal with the demographics. They need to make sure that they deny Palestinians return to the homeland, because without they had agreed to the demographics, even under the partition plan, the Palestinians would form over 40% of the population of the Jewish designated state, according to the partition plan of 1947. And that they wanted to make it seize the opportunity to ensure that they will be able to control as much land as possible with as less Palestinians as possible. And that is really a key rationale or key guiding principle of the Zionist movement, that we should be making sure that we control the land, and that this land will not have as many Palestinians as possible. The second thing that they need to take care of is the fact that they need to establish control over the land itself. So not only denying people from returning, Palestinians from returning to their homes, they needed to create a legal system, legal regime in order to justify the takeover, the confiscation, the appropriations of property and land. And that was done through a series of laws. The present absentee law is one of the major vehicles that was used, basically announcing or declaring any Palestinian, anyone who had fled or have not been present after 47 would be declared an absentee, and then as a result, their property could be confiscated or could be brought under the control of a custodian. And that custodian ultimately over years transferred some of that property into Israeli government agencies or authorities that were able then to make sure that this will be exclusively used only by Jewish Israeli citizens through, again, different kinds of mechanism, particularly through the idea of allowing the Jewish agency, which, by the way, was registered during in the turn of the 20th century as a foreign organization or body, and was given a quasi-governmental status within the state of Israel that allowed the government to contract with the Jewish agency in order to help build Jewish-only towns on the ruins of Palestinian towns and villages. So those kinds of the demography and land confiscation, so the control over land and stripping the land of the Palestinian indigenous community, were two key principles that guided the government from day one. And at the same time, there was a strict control over the Palestinian population. So political parties were really, virtually were not existent. I mean, other than the communist Israeli Communist Party, which was a Jewish and Arab kind of party, there was really very, very little political activism during that time until we see that the Harakat al-Ard and the beginning of the 60s, and then into 70s, when then, even though it was outlawed, there's much more freedoms, particularly after the elimination of the military regime. So there was also political control and domination of one group, making sure that Palestinians don't have access to the centers of power in the state of Israel. They don't have access to their national resources. Eventually you'd have all the major institutions that provide the basic economy of Israel was basically created on the ruins of the Palestinians. There's a lot of historical documentation of how many Palestinian companies, any of the infrastructure itself that was there, was all of this overnight, again, taken over by Israel through official government policies, and provided the benefits or the services to mainly to the Jewish majority. And the last point that was really important was to bring more Jewish people to live and to settle in that new state. And that has been done also through number of policies and laws that were passed in order to facilitate what is called in Hebrew Aliyah. That is to move to Israel, and it seems as if you are ascending to a place where you are basically granted full citizenship. Any Jewish person in the world, proving that he or she are actually Jewish, can claim full citizenship in the state of Israel by stepping foot in Israel. Obviously, there are a lot of institutions, including the Jewish Agency, that facilitate this sort of encouragement of Jews to immigrate and live in Israel. And so you have, on one hand, Palestinians denied return to their homeland. At the same time, Jewish agencies, Jewish organizations, Israeli government main goal was to make sure that they are absorbing, so-called, that was the term, absorbing new immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and taking sometimes advantage of incidents or situations in those countries to ensure that they are getting the refuge. For example, sometimes pressuring other countries not to allow Jewish refugees or Jewish citizens to immigrate to other countries, but rather come to the state of Israel, or instigating violence in certain countries, like have we seen in Egypt, for example, later on, there's a lot of other, again, historically proven, the way that that this sort of making sure that Palestinians denied entry, but making Israel as the exclusive state for the Jewish majority, essentially made the Palestinians powerless, marginalized them, stripped them of any power, of any connection, and ability to resist, and ability to be able to put forward any struggle that will be able to really have a chance of success. And that has over years changed because of different political development that we can talk about later.
Dr. Nassar, please respond.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just, thank you for that legal framework. I think that was really important. And the two key elements that Jamil just highlighted, which was control over the land and trying to control and shift the demographic reality, those are in fact what we see in settler colonial movements around the world. So I think it's important to take a step back and think about Israeli policy, not just as an exceptional thing or something they did on its own, but sort of that was unique, but that was part of a larger settler colonial framework that Israel undertook. So there's a historian named Patrick Wolf who talks about the conquest of land and the logic of elimination of the native, those are his words, as being the two key pillars of settler colonialism. And we see that very clearly in the early years of the state. We see conquest of land, not only conquest of land in terms of expelling Palestinians, but also confiscating land of those who remained. So in the early years of the state of Israel confiscated 70% of the land that was owned by Palestinians who in fact remained in Palestine. And they tried to do all kinds of legal appeals to get that land back, but to no avail. The other portion of it, the idea of the elimination, again, we see it initially in the 1948 war through expulsion. But there's another way to think about it, which is trying to strip the natives, in this case, the indigenous Palestinians who became citizens of Israel, strip them of their political identity as Palestinians and strip them of their connection to the Arab world. So all of the legal mechanisms that Jamil just eloquently explained, from the surveillance and control of parties, political parties, to the surveillance and control of the education system, to the censorship of newspapers and poetry and literary productions, to the restrictions on movement, especially if you were a Palestinian and you were known to be politically active. You were often slapped with various forms of curfews. So Mahmoud Darwish and Samih al-Qasim, as they started becoming more famous with their poetry, they would be slapped with like house arrest, essentially, where they can't leave their houses from a certain time, basically from sunset to sunrise, to try to prevent them from going to poetry festivals or other kinds of events. And they would have to check in with the police office, with the police station, twice a day to show that they haven't left their town or their place of residence in order to go somewhere else for an event. So all of these things were deliberately put into place to try to strip Palestinians of their connection to the Palestinian people and the Arab people more broadly, while telling them at the same time, you are now Israeli, you should be grateful to be Israeli, you are Arab Israelis, and we're not giving you all of your rights, but you should be grateful for the rights that you have, and if you complain too much, you're gonna get punished. Essentially was the way in which the state sort of formed and pushed their way through trying to eliminate a sense of Palestinian identity among those who remained. So those are the two key pillars. And again, I want to stress that this isn't unique necessarily to Israel, that it's part of the settler colonial logic that we see in the United States. We see it in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and elsewhere. And in fact, early Israeli legal scholars drew on discriminatory citizenship laws from other countries to inform their own. So the difficulty with which Palestinians had to obtain citizenship, to prove residence and prove they didn't leave and so forth, those kinds of things were informed by other settler colonial regimes elsewhere as well. So those are some of the ways in which that happened in the early years, and I'm happy to continue. We can talk more about the ways in which that continues even today.
Oh, no, absolutely. We'll definitely touch on that. One key point I wanted to focus on here. Israel self-defines as Jewish and democratic. And then, I mean, I don't want to move too into the modern period, but 2 years ago, it enacted a basic law, which is, I mean, Israel does not have a constitution. It just has a bunch of, it's like a constitution in pieces. So, I mean, this is for the audience so that they have some good background here. So one of the provisions of this constitution in pieces came two years ago in the form of what's called the nation-state law, in which it constitutionalizes this constant emphasis on Israel being a Jewish and democratic state. First of all, a serious question. Well, it's not really that serious because I know the answer. Can these two things coexist? Can you have a Jewish state and a democratic state? Are these contradictory terms? Can you implement a democracy, of true democracy with full equality for all, political, national, civil, in all aspects, when you have this self-definition? Dr. Nassar, I'll start with you and then we'll go back to Jamil.
Sure. I mean, I think the blunt answer is no. I think it's inherently contradictory to say that we're going to privilege one particular ethno-national group and extend democratic rights to them, but then somehow pretend that we're also a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious democracy, which is part of the Israeli propaganda. Frankly, if you listen to Israeli presentations, they show you very pretty PowerPoint presentations of look at our Arabs and look at our Muslims and look at our Armenians and look at all these pretty people from different parts of the world. Whereas the reality simply is that you cannot privilege a single ethno-national group over others and claim to also uphold equal rights for all.
You forgot that you also have Arabs in the Knesset. You have an Arab Supreme Court justice. You have Arabs in the workforce.
So yes, thank you for that, because it's something that we hear often, especially those of us who talk about Palestine in the U.S. It's something we hear quite often. And again, I think a comparative lens can be useful here. For a long time, people in the United States said, well, African Americans shouldn't complain. Look at Jackie Robinson. Look at, African Americans in Congress. Look at President Obama, right? So there shouldn't be. So looking at exceptions to try to argue for a rule is logical fallacy, first of all. And second of all, it doesn't address the structural inequities that, while individuals may be able to overcome at times, it's not available and extended to all. And you can go through, and I mean, we can all go through the ways in which we see parallels here. I mean, the poverty rate among Palestinian citizens of Israel is twice that of Jewish Israeli citizens. The high school dropout rate for Palestinian citizens of Israel is significantly higher than that of Jewish Israelis. Their university admission rates are significantly lower. The ways in which sociologists and anthropologists have documented the casual racism that Palestinian citizens of Israel face, even in professional realms. So we're often familiar with the right-wing racism, the anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism that we hear from football fans and right-wing Israelis. But even those who work in hospitals and law firms and universities and so forth, speak of the ways in which supposedly enlightened, liberal, Zionist Israeli Jews are also discriminating against them, are also expecting them to be less than, and they have to go over and above to prove themselves to be professionally competent. And then there's an expression, oh, you're not like the other ones. So the kinds of casual racism that Palestinian citizens of Israel face is also very much a part of the structure of society. So notwithstanding the individual Palestinians who become Knesset members or Supreme Court justices or reality TV stars or what have you, the structural racism and the ways in which that permeates into everyday society at all levels is something that we need to also pay attention to.
No, absolutely. And Dr. Nassar, you touched on the heart of it, I believe. The structural element involved is what's key. These few exceptions here should not, as you say, be an exception or be used to ignore the rule. Jamil, please chime in.
So, on the question of the Jewish and democratic state, I totally agree. It's hard to reconcile the two. Because there is a clear contradiction when democracy is about inclusivity. Democracy is about full equality. There's no distinction whatsoever. Democracy is about making sure that the state is neutral in the way that it relates to the citizens. It doesn't take a stand or is biased or has an animus towards a particular community. And then in the state of Israel, clearly the notion of democracy is the distorted one. And it's very hard to sometimes to kind of overcome the way that it's being propagandized in the West, particularly, because as we know, democracy is not just about elections. It's not just about having representatives, right? And even if they get elected, the question is the fundamentals of the state. What are the fundamentals? What are the basic ingredients? What is the DNA of the state? And in the case of Israel, it's really first, and by the way, this term Jewish and democratic state is a relatively a new one. It started with the adoption of the basic law on human dignity and liberty in 1992. Which, as you said, was part of the piecemeal adoption of a constitution informing, meaning, there was a difficulty for the founders, particularly Mapai and the Ben Gurion, who was the founder really of the state of Israel, to put a formal constitution because he had a problem with the religious elements of the religious parties elements in the Israeli politics. And it also, there was an idea that, do we really want to have this sort of formal structure that would limit the way that the government can act on a number of national security issues? So they delayed the idea of adoption of a constitution, and they started to adopt basic laws. And the first basic laws are actually the ones that are most kind of the basic law of the land of Israel, or the basic law of the Knesset, the basic law of the Israeli government. And there was no mention of equality in any of the first basic laws. And to this day, there's not a single basic law that articulates and specifically and explicitly protects the right to equality. So from that standpoint, if you look at any kind of definition of democracy, if a democracy doesn't have a formal constitutional framework that protects the right to equality in a way that includes all people who live under control of that state, then there's a serious fundamental problem. The second thing is the fact that the state was established as a Jewish state. Or if you look at the first documents, including the Declaration of Independence, it talks about the state of the Jewish people. Without necessarily, there's a lot of debate about what's the definition of a Jewish state or the state of a Jewish people. And in fact, as you know, some of the religious non-Zionist element of the political parties in Israel rejected the Zionist definitions of the Jewish state, and they to this day they actually deny or are opposing to the character of the state of Israel as a one that has using the Jewish character as a political form, as a Zionist form, and rather they see it from their own religious understanding of what the state should be from their own ideology. But for the Palestinians, both of those terms didn't mean they didn't speak to them. It didn't include them. It didn't. In fact, it only alienated them. And it only made it much harder for any Palestinians to feel that they are truly treated equally. And so the idea that there's I think one of the Supreme Court decisions of the Israel Supreme Court, I think it was in the case of the El-Ard movement, because there was always challenges brought against political parties to run for the Israeli elections. This is almost unheard of in any democratic state, where you have a constant attempt, sometimes official attempts by the Attorney General, sometimes by parties of either the ruling party or other like more right-wing parties to disqualify parties of minority groups that are calling for Israel to become a state of all its citizens, to be truly a real democracy. And you've seen, and I worked for an organization called Adalah that had challenged all of these attempts to disqualify Palestinian parties from running for those elections. So even though you see that there are elected officials, Palestinians elected in the Knesset, their election is being hard fought and has been actually a big compromise, because every single party that runs in the Israeli parliamentary election has to confirm that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, and they should also not glorify acts of terrorism, which was added in an amendment a few years ago. But the idea that you have to accept Israel as a Jewish state is inherently, I think, humiliating and in fact undemocratic, because it means that you have to accept a priori, before you even entered into the political system, that there is a priority and there is a superiority for a particular community that is, in this case, a Jewish community, because the state as itself is defined as a Jewish state. And now the thing is, it's not just a character of the state because of the majority of the people who live in Israel. Israel is a Jewish state. No, it's in the DNA, made to be a Zionist Jewish state, and before the Jewish nation state law that was enacted 3 years ago. So up to 2018, you have a constitutional framework, even though we're not talking about a constitution, but the basic laws essentially did not include the right to equality as a protected constitutional value. It made it clear that there is something called Jewish and democratic, and there should be a balancing between what a Jewish state is and what democratic state is. And in those kinds of situations, particularly for Palestinian citizens, they don't have anything to be able to hold on to or to use the Jewish character of the state in order to protect their status. In order to protect their status, they only had to appeal to the democratic part of the definition. And that part is clearly lacking. And so you have a system that is designed to have a particular community that is belonging to a particular religion that has more superiority and domination over the other party. And that's why when you are looking at the definition of the crime of apartheid, you have to really be very careful about when you go and analyze and read the different laws that were enacted in the state of Israel and the policies that were based on these laws that essentially really perpetuated this domination of one particular ethnic community, largely the Jewish community, over non-Jews, mainly Palestinians, who are the non-Jews. Of course, there are a substantial number of non-Jewish community in Israel who are not defined or don't define themselves as Palestinians, particularly those who immigrated from the former Soviet Union, who alleged that they were Jews that end up not being Jews under the law of return, and they are other or no category in their identity. And there are over like 300,000 or maybe more now that I think there are hundreds of thousands of them that live in the state of Israel that are not Jews. But back to the point of the contradiction, that contradiction really makes it much harder for any Palestinian on the individual level and the collective level, because right now you have Jews can exercise their group rights as Jews, as a Jewish community, both religiously, ethnically, and nationally. But then Palestinians, particularly under the 2018 nation-state law, are relegated to the most inferior situation that you can have. And that status is that they don't have the right to self-determination. The state is exclusively now, under the nation-state law, defined as the state of the Jewish people, as a Jewish state, essentially. And again, in the new basic law that was adopted, there is complete disregard to their right of equality. And that's why you heard voices from, for example, Palestinian Druze community, Arab Druze who serve in the Israeli military, outraged at this new law. They say, well, we serve in the military. You are treating us you have said that we have this alliance of blood because we fight with you in the wars against Israel's enemy, and yet you excluded us by not including the right of equality. I think that the problem is not to include only the right of equality. The problem is more fundamental. It goes into the ideas of how can a state be defined as only belonging to a particular religious community, ethnic religious community. And again, it's different than a nation state, other nation states, because other nation states, you don't have this, because in a way of the way that religion has become also a nation as part of the nationality, of the defining moment. So you are really, there's very few, I really challenge anyone to find a democracy, a real democracy, a liberal democracy that is defined based on the religious affiliation of the communities. And I think that is really antithetical to the idea of democracy. And therefore, the Palestinian citizens, their continuing existence is now essentially in opposition to the fundamentals of the state. That's why it's very easy to exclude them from anything that the state can do, can justify and greenlight and legitimize a lot of the law, a lot of the policies that were maybe could be challenged, it could be, but now, the issue, the idea of settling the land or give priority to Jews to settle the land, right? That has been done over and over in the years through different laws. Now they have a basic law that entrenches that and excluding Palestinians from all other, again, on equal footing. So I think that the Supreme Court just heard a challenge a few weeks ago, actually just a month ago, or less than a month, where a number of petitions were filed, including by Adalah, by ACRI, Association for Civil Rights in Israel. And I encourage people, hopefully it will be translated to English, to listen to the argument, to the Supreme Court argument, and the way that the Supreme Court justices in Israel were so hostile to the idea of the challenge to the law, because they are so. Their thinking was that you can't really be serious of telling us that there's such a thing that you can't reconcile between democracy and a Jewish state.
Thank you so much for that legalistic framework. And I'm glad you highlighted the basic law on human dignity and liberty, and emphasizing the fact that it intentionally omits the word equality. Interestingly enough, in that same law, there's an exception to the law. So there's no violation to human dignity and liberty except laws that are befitting to the values of the state of Israel, and those values are Jewish and democratic. So long as it is an apartheid policy, it's perfectly fine. But if it's not, you can't enact it. And one element that the audience really needs to grasp from this is that Israel makes a distinction. A lot of the talk in the media, the U.S. shares our values. We have shared values. That's a Republican talking point. Interestingly enough, Israel makes a distinction by law and in practice between nationality and citizenship. So it's the nationals of the state, which are the Jewish people. They're the ones that the rights flow from that. So while the Palestinian Arabs have the right to vote, they can, have, own property, I guess, in some areas, even though 93 or 96% of the area is owned either by the state or privately by Jews, and only 3.5% or so are owned by the Palestinian Arabs. So you have this entrenchment like you talk about. I wanted to talk about another topic, unless Dr. Nassar has something to comment on that. I know there was a lot said there.
Yeah, let's hear from the next comment that you wanted to mention. Okay,
these kind of work in tandem, I believe. I want to talk about the diminishing role of the Palestinian citizens of Israel during the Oslo period, and also a decade or so later with the introduction of the 4 key documents that became known as the Future Vision documents. Mm-hmm. Now, was that a reconceptualization of the Palestinians inside Israel? Was that something more? Can you just expound on that?
Sure, and I'm glad you asked about them together because they are in many ways, they flow from one another. So in the early 90s, well, really starting from the late 80s, from the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, which makes no mention of Palestinian citizens of Israel, onward, so from 1988 onward, we start to see the Palestinian national leadership really ignore and in many ways exclude Palestinian citizens of Israel from the Palestinian National Project as it was conceptualized vis-a-vis the two-state solution. So Palestinian citizens are excluded from the two-state vision. They're not really talked about much in any way. They're not included in any way. Meanwhile, you have an increasing push-pull factor within the Israeli state saying, and you need to recognize us. Even liberal Zionists start saying in the 1990s, you need to recognize Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So you have over the course of the 1990s, both in sort of Palestinian citizens being pushed away by the Palestinian national leadership and also being given these like litmus tests to be able to assimilate into Israeli society. And many Palestinian citizens over the course of the 1990s tried to play that game. They tried to go into vote for liberal Zionist parties, enter into dialogue groups. Some of them even like served in the military and things like that, under the assumption that, well, two states are going to come. We need to solidify our claims here within Israel. And so that's just the game. The PLO is negotiating with Israeli prime ministers. Who are we to say otherwise? So that continued up until really the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada shattered that myth, or that myth that their path forward could be through assimilation. You had the uprisings of just starting in September of 2000, and then just a few weeks later, like 2 weeks later, you had solidarity demonstrations inside the Green Line, and Israeli military police forces opening live fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 13 protesters who were citizens of Israel. 12 of them were citizens of Israel. And so this really was a shock to many Palestinian citizens, and it really broke the idea that their path forward lay through assimilation. So Israel basically was treating them as colonial subjects, even though they themselves were citizens of Israel. And so that realization that we see in the early 2000s as a result of the Second Intifada, and also as a result of the fact that the perpetrators were not punished. There was a big commission called the Orr Commission, which acknowledged the inherent inequalities that Palestinian citizens faced, acknowledged them even as they called them an indigenous minority, but there was no follow-up to that at all. And so that nothing actually changed on the ground. That report came out in 2003. So then a few years after that, more and more Palestinians, and especially Palestinians from the groups that Jamil mentioned. So people who are veterans of Al-Ard movement, people who are veterans of the National Democratic Alliance or Tajamma, and other kind of nationalist groups and Palestinian-oriented groups that never really bought into this myth of, that we can have equality, started to develop these framework documents. And they came out over the course of 2006, 2007, collectively known as the Future Vision documents. And what's really remarkable about them is that they, in many ways, re-entrench and recommit the Palestinian citizens of Israel to the Palestinian national cause. So the Haifa Declaration, which is one of them, talks about Israel being a settler colonial state, for example. And so this explicit use of the framework and the language of settler colonialism, of Palestinians as an indigenous people, and of them being connected to the Palestinians around the world. I mean, when Al-Ard tried to do that in 1965, they were outlawed, and their leaders were forced into exile. So this is in many ways a kind of coming back to the roots of the idea that, at least for some Palestinians, for many, I would argue, Palestinians, they see themselves very much as a fundamental part of the Palestinian people. And those Future Vision documents was a way to both assert that and to bring to the fore Israel's project as being a settler colonial one.
Yeah, if I may comment on that, I agree. This is terrifically said. Thank you. I think that what I would add is that after Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo Accords, not only we've seen the tendency of some Palestinian citizens of Israel in going along with the idea that you can have full equality and individual rights in the we called it Asrali. Israelization. There was also, on the other hand, another kind of, even though wasn't very prominent at the time, wasn't clear to everyone, there was a process of looking inward. Different movements, different political parties, civil society organizations, looking at how can we now manage ourselves, that the Palestinian leadership in exile essentially rejected us as part of the Palestinian cause and the national liberation. And so there was a need for these voices to come. And that's why you saw in the mid-90s a number of organizations, key organizations that were formed, a number of political parties, or at least movements that came together. And the National Democratic Alliance, the Tajammu al-Watan al-Demokrati, was the formation of that sort of political consciousness, meaning we are going to form a new political thinking and challenge to the state of Israel from within that has never been tried in the most stark way, which is that that's why, and those elements, I think, are clearly seen in the Haifa Declaration and the Vision documents. The idea that analyzing the state of Israel as a state that is an inherent contradiction between Jewish and democratic state, the call for full equality and that Israel should be a state for all its citizens, essentially calling for Israel to be a one-state democratic state, but within the confines of the Israeli legal system. Remember, you will be outlawed if you just called for Israel to be a one-state for all Palestinians under one kind of secular constitution. And so they had to navigate that in a way that would allow them to be able to participate and continue to work internally, while at the same time challenge the state of Israel from within. And that's why the former well, at the time, it was the head of the Shabak, Israel Security General Services, called these documents as a strategic threat to the state of Israel. And from there, you've seen the total shift, or I would say escalation, in the way that the state apparatus started to see more laws, more oppressive policies, in order to undermine this idea that there is an internal challenge to Zionism, and using the same tools that the state of Israel has created, which has become more challenging to explain outside the state of Israel and the international community. Going outside and how does justices of the Supreme Court can really explain their decisions, etc. So there were some gains and wins, but then in 2000, with the eruption of the Intifada, the Second Intifada, the Palestinian citizens found themselves part of that Intifada, but in their own way. I mean, they could, of course, the militarization of the Intifada that happened in the West Bank, Gaza, didn't really happen inside Israel for the reasons that they knew that there are some limits on how they could be able to resist, and that's always been unique to the struggle, right? But at the end of the day, what we're seeing today is that all these things that are happening are bringing the Palestinians actually to a point where they could be more powerful. The problem is they are facing such internal strife, internal crisis within the Palestinian community that is really pushed or fueled by the Israeli government. The fact that we have now a crime, the high crimes and the killings and murders in the Palestinian society inside Israel really remind us of many other communities of color in the United States, for example. The way that the war on drugs was launched against the racist war on drugs, or the way that militarization, or the way that communities were pushed to the side to have their own internal crisis, so that to distract from the real issues, from their real fundamental challenge to the state. That's why you see, for example, the state of Israel is not taking seriously murders that happen in Palestinian community, gun violence that is spreading and killing more and more young people in this society. So in that sense, there is a shift that is distraction. But I think overall we still see, and this upcoming elections, I think will be an opportunity to see whether the Palestinian leadership will continue to work together or it will be fragmented, as Netanyahu is trying to do by pushing this idea that I can actually help you get out of your trouble of I can provide you with vaccine. I'm not going to provide that to the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza. So you better stay with me because I'm going to be their savior. Are they going to withstand this challenge, both the internal one and the external one coming from the state institutional racism? And are they going to be able to articulate with Palestinians outside Israel, in the West Bank, Gaza, and then in diaspora, the idea and the new vision for liberation that would include them and would include the situation in reality, and would also have answers to Israeli citizens? Ultimately, the liberation of Palestinians will have to be also include the liberation of Israeli citizens, Jewish citizens, from their own understanding of where they should be living and what is best to protect their human dignity and as human, but as communities. And that is, I think, something that we are seeing recently talk about this apartheid regime by B'Tselem, is a main prominent Israeli human rights organization, saying that we don't think that it's only apartheid in the West Bank, it also covers Israel. Something the Palestinians for years have analyzed and proved that was the case. And yet now we're seeing some prominent voices like the former head of the Jewish agency, Avram Burg, coming and challenging the fact that he doesn't want to have Jewish on his identity card. He wants to challenge the idea that what is it that the state can do these are changes that are really significant. And I think the Palestinian citizens and their leadership have an opportunity to expand their appeal to the Jewish Israeli community and to de-Zionize and to eliminate the Zionist element of the state. That is the only way that you can build a democracy that is really true to the fundamentals of a country that will be that protect everyone regardless of who they are.
Thank you so much for that. I really do like the emphasis on the indigeneity of the Palestinians in these future vision documents. I think that goes to the root of it all. That we're not strangers, we're not foreigners, we're not immigrants. We've always been here. Families have been here for generations, for centuries, for millennia, and so on. I can't believe it's actually been just a little bit over an hour. I do want to take two of the questions that were presented. So one of them is, can you comment on the territorialization of the Palestinian peoples, as in the divisions that Israel government has created amongst Palestinians via assignment of jurisdiction, dividing people in the West Bank, Gaza, 48, etc., in an attempt to estrange the Palestinians from one another, and what social implications does this have?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about this. So this is an ongoing project that didn't start with 1967. In fact, it actually goes back to 1948 and the ways in which Israel set up laws to prevent Palestinians from being in contact with one another, whether it's through the prevention of the return of refugees or whether it's through internal division. So part of the structure of the military government was to set up checkpoints and different areas that would prevent Palestinians from being able to go even within the territory that had become recognized as part of the Israeli state. So if you're in Haifa and you want to go to Nazareth, initially it was very difficult to do so. Later on in the 50s, those internal checkpoints were lifted, but again, if you were politically active, you still had restrictions on movement. Other forms of restriction on the ways in which the different communication could happen. And even after 67, there was a brief moment in time when the borders were kind of opened up and Palestinian citizens could visit their relatives in the occupied territories and vice versa. But after a while, those too got shut down and they also became restricted. More recently, we see the erection of various borders through both the apartheid wall and the various kinds of physical barriers to prevent Palestinians from being able to travel freely in their homeland and being able to connect to one another. But we also see various legal infrastructures as well. Laws, for example, that prohibit Palestinian citizens who marry Palestinians from the West Bank to be able to grant their spouse citizenship is sort of just one example of many. Also, the ways in which people's citizenship can be potentially stripped from them, or their residencies can be stripped from them, especially for Palestinians who are residents of Jerusalem. So there are all kinds of ways to try to legally and infrastructurally chop up and separate out Palestinians based on the different geographic locations on which they lived. And then there's also a discursive one that we also need to be attuned to, a way in which people talk about, so the use of the term, for example, Arab Israelis, or talking about Gazans, or talking about people in the West Bank, or talking about the refugees, where the word Palestine isn't uttered in any of those, right? So again, a denial of the Palestinian identity is another way to try to center the specific subnational jurisdiction as being the primary identifying marker, as a way to also eliminate Palestinian identity.
Yeah, I would add one another element is the economic class element. By providing those kind of seemingly incentives, or showing that, look, Palestinian citizens of Israel, look, they have more, their quality of life much better than yours, and compared to like other Palestinians or even Arab citizens in terms of what they, and then of course the comparison is never with Jewish Israelis. The comparison is always with other Palestinians who are in much worse situations. So, and the way that Israel uses economy, and for example, integration of Palestinian women now is not really part of the idea that we want to provide equal access and equality and opportunity. It's really seen from a prism of that is good for the Israeli economy. If more Arab and Palestinian women in Israel are part of the workforce. So all of these things of like using economic incentives, economic parameters in order to divide and to show that, you know, if you are loyal enough to the state, we will give you incentives. So that's what was given, for example, to within Palestinian citizens of Israel, you know, the division between Muslims, Christians, and Druze. And now Israel even have a particular law that had given a particular status to Christian citizens, as if they're, and that by hinting that, oh, there's our Druze community, they are not Arabs, they're not Palestinians, there's no history of that, and they're a Christian community, they're not part of the Palestinian people, and of course, and you are only left with the Muslim majority of the Palestinians, and kind of also makes the case that it is really not only a demographic problem, but it's also Islamophobic problem, right? And so there's all these economic things that come with, if you serve in the military, we'll give you more rights. If you serve in the military, you get a free tuition to study. If you join and don't criticize and you deny your own identity, you get maybe a promotion within the judicial system. I think that there are a lot of that is proven to be wrong. I think that most people, although some Palestinians would take those kinds of individual opportunities, but at a whole, it's a failed system. There's never been more, I think, idea of Israel is selling itself as if, look, you're better off here. It's just like when United States and we're telling some black people, you know, you're better off here than in Africa, or in some situations in under South Africa apartheid system, you're better off as a black second class or third class citizens under apartheid system, better off than look at the infrastructure of the nearby countries. Do you want to really live there? Those kinds of things are always been ways that, again, the settler colonial and regimes that are really trying to perpetuate the domination of one group over the other finds the way in order to make that case. And in the particular case of the Palestinians, it's now, I think, looking really ridiculous when you see that the Palestinians Israel is denying Palestinians vaccines in the West Bank and Gaza, even though they have international legal authority or obligation to do so, while claiming that, look, the 1 million vaccinated person was from Al-Fahim, and Bibi Netanyahu was trying to have a photo op with the person who was vaccinated in Al-Fahim, so we are treating Palestinians and Arab. No one is buying that. This is totally a failed propaganda that is really maybe it's working on some Jewish Israelis, but I think the world understands that there's a serious problem, and I hope that means that the Biden administration will understand the new reality on the ground for all Palestinians. I will not deal with the issue with the idea that, oh, we can just talk to some part of the Palestinian, or we will relate to only part of the Palestinian people. But if they really want to solve and address the serious issues of problems in Palestine, I think they will have to really look at the fundamentals. And the fundamentals go to the way that Israel has been structured and formed, the way that they've been treating Palestinians, and centering Palestinian refugees is not just by renewing budgets to UNRWA. It's about understanding the idea of why people would, after decades of being outside Palestine, why would they still want to be part of their homeland? And recognizing that and push for recognition and acknowledgement of the historic injustice, because all of the different talk about we are going to reset the peace process without understanding the fundamentals, it's going to be very hard to come to a point other than entrenching the current situation and making it worse. Not only for Palestinians, by the way, it will only continue to be worse, but also for Israeli Jews. So if you care about either side, I care about all sides in terms of as people who I think, because there are some people who I consider my friends in the Israeli Jewish community, who I see them as partners in challenging and changing the reality. And by doing so, we have to really strip this idea that Israel is a democracy and challenge this myth. And what is that really? And the nation state law is clearly the vehicle for addressing this issue in a way that we haven't had before. Just like under Trump, people saw the danger of white supremacy. I think under Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing government, they now better understand the danger of these laws that are really trying to entrench the Zionism in the way that would impact the fundamental right of people who are not Jews. And that, I think, is something that people in the United States relate to more than anything else, that no one should be left behind. No one should be excluded. If you're going to talk about equality, and you have to talk about human rights, these are for all people, and you can't use religion, you can't use domination by one group, you can't really deny the existence of the Nakba and other injustices that happen to the Palestinians. You start from there, and then you get to the point where you'll be able to address practical solutions in order to build something new that is based on real liberation, not an illusion of a solution.
I wish this session was 2 hours long. Dr. Nassar, you wanted to jump in just really quickly?
Yeah, I just want to, I know we're over time, so I just wanted to wrap up with, I think, an appeal really to the audience members who are watching, which is to remember now the forgotten Palestinians, to recognize that the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who are living inside their original homeland, who have tenaciously held on and remained in their homeland against incredible odds, are very central and core to the Palestinian struggle for justice. That it's not just about the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, as important as they are. It's not just about Palestinian refugees, as important as they are. That any true and lasting peace, any true justice in this region for Palestinians and for Jews and for everyone who cares about this region, any solution must include the rectification of the injustices that we've been talking about here today.
Oh my God, thank you so much for those concluding remarks. I just want to thank both of our distinguished speakers for joining us for this great and very important webinar. I did want to stress something that you brought up, Jamil, and that is that even though with the right-wing government, we see this host of laws that have come in the last few years that are institutionally discriminatory towards the Palestinian Arabs, the founding laws that were created by the left-wing Zionist movement. So left, right, it doesn't matter. the consolidation and the pillars of Zionism exist, no matter which spectrum that you're looking at. So I want to thank both of our great speakers. Thank you all for joining us. Next time, I will make sure for a topic like this, I make an hour and a half instead of 1 hour available. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.